Hi class. In this lesson we're going to learn how to factor what's called a trinomial. A trinomial has three terms, 1, 2, 3, and this is the standard form of a trinomial, being ax squared plus bx plus c, okay, alphabetical order there. And what's happening is we're going to use what's called the magic x. This is a method you may not have heard of before with other math classes. The old way of doing it is guess and check. You would have put parentheses underneath, and you would have tried to figure out what multiplied to be the number out in front, what multiplies to be a number out in back, and then you would have had to figure out how the factors add to be the b. Well, you're going to do some of that, but it's going to be a little bit more organized using the x. And the x is set up so that you take your a and you multiply it by your c, and you put that number on top. A times c. Whatever your b is, you put it down on the bottom. Okay? And then what we'll be doing is we'll be looking for numbers that will multiply this way to be a times c, and that will add this way to give you your b. So multiplies up and then adds to the bottom. Now I know this may be confusing because there's no numbers in it, but there's going to be right now. So here we go. We're going to multiply using, or factor using the magic x. So again, the top is your a times your c. Okay? So what that means is you take your 1, that's out in front, that's your a, and multiply it by your c, which is negative 35. And the result is just negative 35. The b is 2, so you write 2 down on the bottom. So now you have to work through what numbers will multiply to be negative 35 and will at the same time add to be 2. Okay, so you got to work through what your factors are of 35, and the one that comes to mind is 7 and 5, because 7 times 5 is 35, and the difference between them is 2, which means I don't put the negative sign on the 7, I put it on the 5, because 7 minus 5 is 2. So a little bit of work there involved in coming up with 7 and negative 5. Now, once you have 7 and negative 5, the rest is easy, and this is where the x becomes a little magical, because we take whatever our first number is, cross out the square, so it's just 1x, and that is what you divide each of these numbers by, 1x. And there's nothing that, I can't actually divide 7 by 1, you're just left with 1x. So what that means is, this is my factor, 1x, or just x, plus 7. That's one of my factors. The other factor is x minus 5. So whatever the thing is on the bottom goes out in front. Whatever's up on top goes behind. So this is my answer, x plus 7 times x minus 5. And what we found was if I FOIL x plus 7 times x minus 5, the result would be x times x is x squared. X times negative 5 would be negative 5x. 7 times x would give me 7x. And then 7 times negative 5 would be negative 35. And that would give me x squared plus 2x minus 35. So what the magic x is doing is it is finding the factors that if you multiplied them like this, you would result in the original equation. Okay. So now we're going to look at one that is in fact prime, because you're going to have an example or an option on most of your problems that says this doesn't factor or it's prime. And that happens if you have a situation like this. 1 times 7 goes on top, 7, and then down on the bottom is a 6. So now you're looking for factors of 7 that adds to be 6. Well, the only factors of 7 are 7 and 1. 7 times 1 is 7, that's not the issue. There's no way to do 7 and positive 1 to get 6. Now, notice I said and positive 1 because the only way to get a positive 7 is either both of these are positive or both are negative. Well, negative 7 and negative 1 gives you negative 8. There's no way to get positive 6. Because of that, this problem is prime and there is no factor. So if that happens, you just click that option in your answer choices. Now let's look at some more options where they do actually factor. This time we have two variables, okay? and that does make a little bit of difference in my final answer. As far as the magic x goes, it doesn't make any difference. Notice there's an x squared, an ax, and an a squared. Okay, that'll just change my problem. What that's going to do, what that will cause in my final outcome, is that in the parentheses, you're going to have an x in the front of each one, and an a in the back of each one. Okay, that's what happens with the variables. Whatever variable's in front will be in the front of the parentheses. Whichever variable is in the back will be in the back of the parentheses. So let's go back to the magic x here. Now, the number in front is a 1. The number in the back is the negative 16. So my a is 1, c is negative 16. That's what you multiply here, a times c. So that gives me negative 16. On the bottom we get a 6. So now I work through the factors of 16, and the factors of 16 are 8 and 2 that add or subtract to be 6. So 8 and 2. Now, 1 has to be positive and 1 has to be negative in order to get the negative on top. So I either put the negative here in front of the 8 or here in front of the negative 2, which is actually where I want it because I want 8 minus 2, not negative 8 plus 2. Negative 8 plus 2 would have given me a negative 6, but I have a positive 6. So I put the negative over here, and these are the numbers that I'm working with now, the 8 and the negative 2. Okay. Now I said in the first problem you divide it by whichever the variable is in the front without the exponent. So I'm dividing each of them by x. Now that means my parentheses are going to be x plus 8 and then x minus 2. Now the only thing that I have to remember is that the back side of the parentheses are supposed to have an a. Okay? Not a squared, just a. And that's the only time this is a little bit goofy is that when we have that variable in the back, you have to actually add it in. You could have added it in, I guess, in the side of the x, but just adding it in the end at the end of the problem will be sufficient. Okay? So that's whenever I have two variables, I have to add the last variable without the exponent at the end. Okay? So x plus 8a times x minus 2a, if I FOIL that, I would get this original equation. Okay, now we're going to factor a GCF first and then use the magic x. Now I say first because if you look at all the numbers and the variables, they all have something in common. First of all, they have a y in common, and they all have a number in common as well. And so you need to think through your factors of 16, 32, and 48. And if you do that, the greatest number that they have in common is 16. Okay, so 16 goes into 16 once, goes into 32 twice, and 48 3 times. So that means I need to rewrite this whole problem to be 16, open parentheses, times, I should pull out a y, 16y, parentheses. And I'm left over with 16y to the third divided by 16y should be 1y squared. So I divided that by 16y. Okay, divide the negative 32 by 16y, and that should give me negative 2y. And then the negative 48 divided by 16y, and the y's will cancel, and I'll get negative 3. Okay, so now the 16y, I leave that alone. That'll just be part of my final answer. But I need to further factor this trinomial, the thing with the three terms, the y squared minus 2y minus 3. And I do that using the magic x. There's a 1 in front times a negative 3. I multiply those. That goes on top to be negative 3. On the bottom, I just bring down my negative 2. Okay. And then I go ahead and figure out what multiplies to be negative 3. Well, the only possibilities are 3 and 1. Well, one has to be positive, the other one has to be negative. And if I put the negative on the 3, when I add those, I'll actually get my negative 2. Had I put it on the 1, that would have given me a positive 2. So that's not going to work. So negative 3. Now, once I have the negative 3 and the 1, I divide each of those by my y without the exponent, just the y. Okay, so I divide each of those by y. And then I reduce if I can, but there's no reducing to be done here. And so the parentheses part will be y minus 3 times y plus 1. And then, as part of my final answer, I just have to make sure that my 16y actually does come down and become part of my final answer. 16y, and then the parentheses y minus 3 times y plus 1 is my final answer here. So again, an example where you have to pull a GCF out first, and you do have some homework problems like this one. And now this is my first example where I do actually have an a, and by that I mean an a other than 1, and so it does make a difference here in part of my process. So you'll see I have my 3x, or my 3 times my 2, which is going to give me 6, and then on the bottom my b term is 7. So there are factors here, 2 and 3, or 6 and 1. Now 6 and 1 are the ones that actually work, 6 and 1, because if I put 2 and 3 here, there's no way I can make 7. So again, you're going to have to do some thinking on your own as far as what your factors are of 6 to get 7. And 6 and 1 give me 7. They both are positive. 6 plus 1 is 7. Now, the next step is what changes now that I have an a term. Because when I divide at this next step and cross out my exponent, I need to divide by the 3 and the x. So each one of these numbers gets divided by 3x. And what happens now is that I actually get to reduce this 6 to be a 2, and the 3 turns into a 1. So that means on the bottom is 1x, so in my parentheses there, that'll be a 1x plus 2. Okay, and then the second one is 3x plus 1. So it's very important to not miss that step where you actually divide it by the number and the variable so that you can get your parentheses factoring here. And then this is the final answer for this particular problem.